Hi everyone, this is Morgan, and in this video I'm going to walk you through using Adobe Lightroom Classic's Develop module. I'm starting with just a shot of my library module. If you need to review anything about how the library module works and how to organize within it, I would refer to past videos within this playlist. So we're going to move on to the Develop module. I'm going to just begin by clicking up here and clicking on the word Develop. You should immediately see that your left panel stays mostly the same. You'll see that there are some presets that appear, so we could play with some of these if we wanted. Generally, I collapse this. I don't use it a ton, but we can still see our collections pretty clearly. That's one good thing about collections is they're pretty easy to view within any module in Lightroom. Our right panel is what changed the most. So I immediately was zoomed really tightly in on the image that I'd selected. A good thing to notice here is we have an automatic zoom in, zoom out just by clicking on the image that's shown here. I also can go over to my navigator and select Fit, which is what's selected right now, Fill, showing an image 1:1, so a close-up view of the 1:1 pixels, 1:2, and we have other options that you can select this drop-down menu and choose here. I'll just go back to Fit. That's where I default most of the time. I also, again, navigating back to that right-hand panel, see that I have my histogram open. I'm getting a little warning here, and we'll go back to what that means later. But just to do the quick tour, I have my histogram. Beneath it, I can see some basic facts about this image. I shot it at ISO 100 with a 70mm lens at f5.6, 1/8 of a second. So it's nice to be able to see that simple metadata right away. I also have a toolbar. We'll play around with a few of these tools in future videos. The one you're most likely to use early on when you're just getting used to Lightroom is the crop tool. That's the one we can play with here. When I select crop, you should see that I have this whole options bar that slides down. One of the things that I can select, and the thing I most often use within this tool, is that I change the aspect. You can see here I have this original drop down, so this is my original crop. I can select 1:1, so a square. I can select letter size. So it's nice to be able to change the aspect so easily and seamlessly. I can click and drag out from any of these corners to change my crop. I also have this angle tool, which I actually also use quite a bit. This is a straightener. So if I click on it, you should see it appears like a little level tool. And I might click and drag along one of these fence lines. So I'm clicking and dragging along something that I think should appear straight. It's at a slight angle here. And this will straighten out my image. So whenever I'm happy with this, I'll hit done, and then my crop is completed. So that's how you use the crop tool. And again, those options will only open up when you select the crop overlay. So in the basic part of my editing, I can see first up is that I can choose my white balance. And I have a lot of white balance options because I shot this as a raw file. So because I shot it as a raw file, when I click this drop down that's starting with as shot, I can go to other preset white balance settings. So I can go to daylight, which is too blue, cloudy, which is maybe kind of close. But I can just see what white balance I think fits this scene the best. This is, I think, sunset in Iceland, so it's going to be maybe tough to find a preset setting that will work. Maybe going back to as shot is fine. If I think as shot is close, but I'd like to tweak it a little bit, I can mess with the temperature, which is on a scale of blue to yellow, or the tint. So if I think it's maybe a little too yellow, I can slide it down and just make a custom white balance setting. If you're new to thinking about white balance, I would encourage you to stick with one of the presets. and to pick the one that as closely as possible mimics the settings that you shot under. So if it was a cloudy day, selecting cloudy is a good default. That's white balance. The next section that addresses tone is where I spend a lot of my time. You can see on my histogram, because we've cut out some of the sides of this image, I'm actually no longer getting that warning. I might uncrop just to bring it back. Yeah, there we go. So I wanted to see this warning to show you how we could resolve it. If I hover over it, it says that I'm getting some shadow clipping. That's probably in one of my darker zones over here. If I move my exposure slider, you should see my histogram changes. So now I don't have that clipping warning. I may try to make it still pretty dark just so it's accurate to my scene. A few notes about changing anything in these sliders. I really encourage you to do pretty naturalistic editing, especially when you're new to editing. So whenever you go past the 0.20 mark on any of these sliders, I would just question yourself. I would stop for a minute. And that's just to make sure that you're not doing something that is going to erase information. So eliminate, highlight, or shadow detail. This is a good stopping point for me. Here you can also see, just to study the histogram. The nice thing about Lightroom is when you hover over a chunk of the histogram, it tells you which section you're looking at. So I have some detail in my blacks, shadows, in my midtones, highlights, and whites. So we do have a spike in the highlights, and my guess is that's the sky. That's this kind of lovely pink highlight we have here. So we can do edits specifically for the highlights. If I click and drag on this slider, you can see that I'm really not moving the position of the shadows very much. It's pretty gradual, but the position of my highlights changes quite a bit. So, and that definitely is that sky. We can see it change pretty dramatically here. So I might pump it up just a little bit to give some more natural contrast. I could do the same thing with the shadows. So deepening the shadows a little bit, we're gonna really see, wow, those were the rocks. I might not change those that much. But again, I'm sticking to doing pretty minor edits. So plus 19 over here, minus 14. Whites and blacks, I think, are more obvious. Oh, I actually started clipping my shadows a little bit. I'll drag that shadow up to -7. Whites and blacks, I don't move as much, but we could definitely move up our whites a little bit just to push that contrast, and my blacks down. Sometimes I just do a general contrast, increase the contrast, decrease the contrast. But more often, I'm tweaking specific sections of the histogram. I find that that's more effective. The next kind of module, or the next little section within your basic developing tools, are these presence options. So texture, I think, is a little more self-explanatory. Dragging it up exaggerates texture differences. Dragging it down often gives you this really hazy look. I'll often bump that up a little bit. Clarity is the next slider, and that deals with mid-tone contrast. So I want you to pay, actually I'm realizing on this image, the changes won't be hyper dramatic because I don't have a lot of mid-tones, period. But you can see it's trying to stretch out or exaggerate any mid-tone differences. So I'll pretty frequently drag my clarity a little bit up. Oftentimes, dragging the clarity up helps an image seem more in focus. You can see that unfortunately I did push some things more into the shadows by making that clarity adjustment. So I'll probably just drag my shadows up until I don't see that. Maybe I'll even make a little exposure adjustment. There we go. And it's kind of, I'm in a way annoyed that I'm having to go back up in my editing chain, but this is a good reminder that as you're making adjustments down here, don't forget to keep tabs on that histogram. Things that you're doing here could still impact it. The next sliders that I want to focus on, dehaze, I think is again a little more straightforward. I am increasing kind of my contrast here. I'm giving it this haze. Dehaze is a little bit more tied into color contrast. So dragging it up can give me a little bit more color differentiation, which is nice. Vibrance and saturation are also related to color. These are pretty exclusively related to color. So a pretty routine question that I get asked is, okay, what's the difference between vibrance and saturation? Saturation, I think, is what we're more used to. We're increasing the saturation of all colors when we slide it to the right, and we're decreasing when we slide to the left. This is one way, it's probably the worst way, but it's a way to turn an image into a black and white image within Lightroom. Vibrance just affects your lower saturation colors exclusively. So here, we have a pretty evenly saturated image, so it's not going to be hyper dramatic, but popping up the vibrance tends to give a little bit more color to your more pastel or more neutral hues. So it can be a nice way to just gain a little bit of visual interest in some of the quieter parts of your image. So this video walks you through the basic editing functions within Lightroom. In a future video, we'll talk more about what's happening down here, especially HSL and color. Thanks, everyone.